March 1943, southern Tunisia. The air is dry, heavy with dust and cordite. A German Panzer IV moves slowly along a shallow ridge, engine rumbling with mechanical confidence. Inside the steel hull, the crew feels protected. Armor this thick has survived British guns, grenades, and rifle fire. Infantry scatter when the tank appears. They always do. But this time, something is different. Ahead, the terrain narrows, olive trees, broken stone walls. Visibility collapses to a few dozen meters. The commander scans through his periscope, alert but unafraid. Enemy infantry is nearby, but infantry has never been the real threat. Then, from close range, a sudden flash. Not an artillery strike, not a mine. A violent impact slams into the tank's flank. The armor doesn't deflect it. It doesn't resist. Instead, the steel buckles inward. Superheated metal fragments tear through the fighting compartment. The shock is instant. The crew has no time to react. Seconds later, smoke pours from the hatch. American infantry lower a long, unfamiliar tube. They stare at the burning tank in disbelief. So do the surviving German soldiers watching from a distance. For the first time, a single foot soldier has destroyed a tank outright, without artillery, without air support, without warning. In that moment, the battlefield changes. And to understand why, we need to step back to a time when tanks ruled the war, and infantry had almost no answer at all.
When the Second World War began, tanks were not just weapons, they were statements of power. Speed, protection, and firepower had finally been fused into a single machine, and no army demonstrated this more clearly than Germany between 1939 and 1941. In Poland, armored spearheads cut through defensive lines faster than commanders could respond. In France, German panzer divisions crossed terrain long considered impassable, bypassing fortifications and collapsing resistance from the rear. Infantry units found themselves facing steel vehicles that could outrun them, outgun them, and shrug off most of what they carried. The tank was not invincible, but to the soldier on the foot, it might as well have been. This perception was not accidental. German armor doctrine emphasized momentum and shock. Tanks were meant to appear suddenly, force rapid decisions, and overwhelm defenses before countermeasures could be organized. Early war Panzer IIIs and IVs were not the heaviest vehicles on the battlefield, but they did not need to be. Most opposing infantry lacked effective, portable anti-tank weapons. Once a tank entered a position, infantry could suppress it, delay it, or hide from it, but destroying it was another matter entirely. The problem was physics. Armor thickness increased faster than infantry firepower. Rifle-caliber weapons were useless. Machine guns could harass exposed crews, but not penetrate steel. Anti-tank rifles, where they existed, were heavy, awkward, and quickly outmatched as armor improved. Grenades required dangerous proximity and precise placement. Mines demanded preparation and favorable terrain. None of these solutions offered a reliable answer during the chaos of combat. As a result, infantry doctrine evolved around avoidance rather than engagement. Soldiers were trained to disperse, seek cover, and wait for artillery or aircraft to intervene. Tanks were someone else's problem, handled by dedicated anti-tank guns positioned well behind the front. But this created a dangerous gap. When tanks broke through faster than guns could be deployed, infantry units were left exposed and psychologically shaken. German crews understood this dynamic well. Tankers were trained to exploit infantry hesitation. Even without firing, the presence of a tank could freeze movement, disrupt communications, and fracture unit cohesion. Commanders reported that enemy soldiers often abandoned positions at the sound of approaching engines. Armor created fear before it created casualties. By 1941, this imbalance had become a defining feature of modern warfare. The tank dictated tempo, infantry reacted. Other nations recognized the problem, but solutions lagged behind reality. Britain relied heavily on towed anti-tank guns, effective when emplaced, vulnerable when moving. The Soviet Union fielded large numbers of anti-tank rifles, which proved marginally effective at close range, but demanded extraordinary bravery and suffered heavy losses. The United States, observing from the outside of the war until late 1941, studied these lessons carefully. American planners understood that future battlefields would be fluid. Infantry would advance, withdraw, and maneuver under constant threat from armor. Waiting for artillery support was not always possible. Air power was not always available. If tanks were to be stopped, infantry needed a weapon they could carry with them, one that did not require complex setup or supporting units. The challenge was not simply to damage a tank, it was to do so decisively, at close range, under fire. Any solution would have to be lightweight, simple, and lethal enough to overcome armor without relying on kinetic penetration alone. That requirement eliminated most conventional approaches. By the time American forces entered the war, it was clear that tanks had reshaped the battlefield faster than infantry doctrine could adapt. The imbalance was temporary, but it was severe, and until it was corrected, every advance, every defense, and every encounter with armor carried an unspoken assumption: the tank held the advantage. That assumption would not survive the war unchanged, because even as tanks dominated Europe and North Africa, a different idea was taking shape, one that did not rely on thicker armor or bigger guns, but on a new way to defeat steel itself.
By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the problem of enemy armor was no longer theoretical. Reports from Europe and North Africa were consistent and blunt. Infantry units without immediate access to artillery or air support were dangerously vulnerable to tanks. Even well-trained troops could be forced out of strong positions by armor alone. The issue was not courage, it was capability. American forces initially relied on the same methods as their allies. Towed anti-tank guns provided reliable firepower, but required time to deploy and were difficult to reposition under pressure. Mines could be effective, but depended on preparation and predictable enemy movement. Grenades and satchel charges demanded suicidal proximity. None of these solutions matched the tempo of modern mechanized warfare. What made the problem more urgent was the direction tank development was heading. German armor was improving steadily. Early war Panzer models gave way to heavier variants with thicker frontal protection and improved survivability. The appearance of vehicles like the Panther and Tiger reinforced a growing belief that tanks were once again pulling ahead of the weapons meant to stop them. Infantry firepower was falling behind at the very moment when mobility and speed were becoming decisive. The American response did not begin on the battlefield. It began in laboratories and proving grounds, driven by a recognition that traditional thinking would not close the gap. The key insight was simple but transformative. Penetrating armor did not require brute force alone. It required exploiting the properties of metal under extreme conditions. This idea was already known in principle. High-explosive anti-tank or heat warheads used shaped charges to focus explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of penetrating armor regardless of velocity. Unlike solid shot, effectiveness depended on explosive geometry rather than impact speed. This meant that a projectile could be launched slowly and still defeat heavy steel. The challenge was delivering such a warhead accurately and safely, using a weapon light enough for infantry to carry. Early experiments existed, but they were either too heavy, too complex, or too unreliable for mass issue. What the U.S. Army needed was not a concept, it was a practical system.
That system emerged through collaboration between American ordnance engineers, physicists, and industrial designers. Borrowing from rocket research and shaped charge theory, they developed a simple launch tube paired with a fin-stabilized rocket carrying a heat warhead. The design avoided recoil, reduced mechanical stress, and allowed a single soldier to operate it effectively. The result was the M1 rocket launcher, soon nicknamed the Bazooka by troops for its resemblance to a novelty instrument popular at the time. Officially adopted in 1942, it was not imposing in appearance. It lacked the weight and presence of traditional anti-tank guns, but its purpose was revolutionary. For the first time, infantry possessed a weapon that allowed them to engage tanks directly without external support. The bazooka did not require elaborate setup. It did not demand exceptional physical strength. It could be carried forward with advancing troops and used from cover. Most importantly, it could kill a tank outright if employed correctly. Early fielding revealed limitations. The first models struggled against angled armor and were sensitive to weather and handling. Training was critical. Range was short. Accuracy depended on calm under fire. But even with these constraints, the psychological shift was immediate. Infantry were no longer helpless observers in the presence of armor. German intelligence took note, but initial assessments underestimated the threat. The bazooka was seen as a niche weapon, dangerous up close, avoidable through tactics and armor improvements. Few anticipated how quickly it would spread, how rapidly it would be improved, and how decisively it would alter infantry-tank encounters once soldiers learned how to use it effectively. The stage was set for confrontation. A weapon designed to give infantry a fighting chance was about to meet crews who had spent years believing that foot soldiers posed little real danger. When those two assumptions collided, the result would be more than damaged tanks. It would be a shock that rippled through doctrine, morale, and the very idea of armored superiority.
For the infantrymen, the arrival of the bazooka did not immediately feel like a miracle. It felt like responsibility. Before it, tanks were something to endure, machines to hide from while hoping heavier weapons arrived in time. Now, a small number of soldiers were trained to do something different, stand their ground. Bazooka teams were usually 2 men. One carried the launcher, the other carried rockets. Their job was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. Let the tank come close, close enough that the shot could not miss, close enough that the crew inside would never see it coming. This changed how infantry moved and fought. Instead of scattering at the sound of engines, units began shaping terrain, waiting in narrow roads, broken villages, forest edges. Fear did not vanish, but it became focused. Soldiers spoke of the moment a tank crossed into range as a test of nerve. If the shot landed, the balance flipped instantly. If it did not, survival depended on seconds. Accounts from North Africa and Italy described the same reaction again and again. When a bazooka round penetrated, the effect was immediate. Crews bailed out or burned. Nearby infantry watched tanks, symbols of dominance, disabled by men on foot. Confidence spread quietly, not bravado, certainty. Infantry still feared tanks, but they no longer believed tanks were untouchable. Technological angle. How the bazooka defeated armor. The weapon's power did not come from speed or mass. It came from physics. The shaped charge inside the rocket focused explosive energy into a narrow jet of superheated metal. When it struck armor, it did not smash the steel. It burned through it. This distinction mattered. Traditional anti-tank rounds relied on velocity. Thicker armor demanded heavier guns. The bazooka ignored that logic. Penetration depended on charge design, not impact speed. Even a slow-moving rocket could defeat armor far thicker than its size suggested. The weapon's simplicity was deceptive. The launcher was little more than a tube with an ignition system. The rocket carried the complexity.
Stabilizing fins, contact fuses, and precise explosive geometry all had to work correctly. Early models were imperfect, but the underlying principle was sound. Once soldiers understood where to aim, flanks, rear plates, lower hull, the results spoke for themselves. Armor designed to resist shells from hundreds of meters away failed against a weapon fired from less than 50. Steel had been outmaneuvered, not overpowered. Enemy angle: the German tank crew. For German tank crews, the bazooka was not immediately visible as a new threat. The first losses were confusing. Reports described tanks knocked out without artillery fire. Crews spoke of sudden penetrations at close range, often from directions thought safe. German doctrine assumed infantry anti-tank weapons were limited and predictable. Tanks were trained to fear guns and mines, not individual soldiers. The bazooka violated that assumption. As encounters increased, unease followed. Tank commanders became more cautious in urban areas and forests. Infantry support became more critical. Movement slowed. The sense of dominance, carefully cultivated since 1939, began to erode at the edges. This was not panic, it was adjustment. But adjustment takes time. And time, by 1943, was something Germany no longer had in abundance, because what began as isolated encounters was about to expand, across terrain, across armies, and across entire campaigns, forcing every side to rethink how tanks and infantry would fight together from that moment forward.
The bazooka did not change battlefields by range, it changed them by distance. Its effective reach was short, often less than 50 meters, but within that space, it forced a fundamental shift in how tanks operated. Terrain that had once favored armor now carried new risks. Urban streets, hedgerows, forests, and broken ground became dangerous. These were places where tanks had relied on speed and intimidation. Now they became ambush zones. Infantry no longer needed to stop a tank's advance entirely. They needed only to wait, position themselves, and strike at the moment armor could not respond. Tactics evolved quickly. Bazooka teams learned to work with riflemen and machine gunners, who suppressed enemy infantry while the launcher closed in. Shots were aimed deliberately: side plates, rear engine compartments, lower hulls. One successful hit was often enough. German units adapted in response. Tanks advanced with tighter infantry screens. Movement became slower, more cautious. Armored thrusts that once relied on momentum now required coordination at every step. The tank was still powerful, but no longer independent. What the bazooka introduced was friction. Every village, every tree line, every narrow road forced armor to pause and consider threats that could not be detected easily or neutralized from range. Leadership angle: doctrine under pressure. At the command level, the bazooka created a problem that doctrine had not anticipated. Armored warfare theory emphasized concentration, speed, and breakthrough. Infantry anti-tank defense was expected to come from guns and mines, not individual soldiers. American leadership adapted quickly. Training emphasized combined arms at the lowest levels. Infantry, armor, and artillery were integrated more tightly. Bazookas were distributed deliberately, not randomly. Commanders planned for close-range tank engagements as part of normal operations, not emergencies. German leadership faced a harder challenge. The appearance of effective infantry anti-tank weapons undermined assumptions that had guided operations since the early war. Countermeasures, such as added armor skirts, revised tactics, and increased infantry support, were introduced, but they addressed symptoms rather than the underlying shift. Doctrine can change quickly on paper. It changes more slowly in practice. By the time lessons filtered through the chain of command, the battlefield had already moved on. Psychological angle. The end of invulnerability. Perhaps the most significant impact of the bazooka was not mechanical or tactical, but psychological. Tanks had carried an aura of invincibility for years. That aura mattered. It shaped how soldiers reacted, how units moved, and how quickly positions collapsed. The bazooka stripped that away. Tank crews no longer assumed that nearby infantry was harmless. Every shadow carried risk. Every delay increased exposure. Confidence gave way to caution, and caution slowed operations. For infantry, the effect ran in the opposite direction. The presence of a bazooka changed posture. Units that once withdrew now prepared ambushes. Fear did not disappear, but it no longer dictated behavior. This shift did not announce itself dramatically. It spread quietly, encounter by encounter. A tank knocked out here, another abandoned there. Over time, belief changed. The battlefield did not belong exclusively to armor anymore. And once that belief took hold, it could not be reversed. Because the bazooka was not a temporary disruption. It was the first clear sign that infantry portable technology had caught up with armored protection. What followed would test that reality at scale, across entire fronts, until no commander could ignore it. That test would come in the largest, most decisive battles of the war.
The moment when the bazooka stopped being an experiment and became a certainty did not arrive all at once. It emerged through repetition, through enough burned-out hulls and abandoned crews that doubt was no longer possible. In North Africa in 1943, American units encountered German armor under conditions that left little room for ambiguity. Open terrain favored tanks, and engagements unfolded rapidly. When bazookas succeeded there, commanders took notice. Reports described Panzer III and IV tanks disabled at ranges previously thought ineffective for infantry weapons. Penetrations occurred without artillery preparation. Tanks were knocked out during advances, not after they stalled. German after-action reports reflected confusion more than outrage. Losses were initially attributed to mines or unseen guns, but patterns began to emerge. Damage assessments showed inconsistent with kinetic shells. Entry points were small. Internal damage was catastrophic. In Italy later that year, the effect intensified. Mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and built-up villages compressed combat distances. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Infantry was always nearby. Bazooka teams operated from upper floors, stone walls, and reverse slopes. Shots came from angles armor designers had never prioritized. German units adapted tactically, but adaptation brought cost. Tanks advanced more slowly. Infantry screens thickened. Every movement demanded caution. Momentum, the essence of armored warfare, eroded under the weight of uncertainty. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the bazooka was no longer a novelty. It was integrated into infantry formations as a standard response to armor. Training emphasized patience and placement. Soldiers were taught not to fire at maximum range, but to wait, sometimes until tanks were nearly upon them. The bocage magnified the effect. Hedgerows restricted visibility and movement. Tanks could not see threats until they were dangerously close. Bazooka teams used these conditions deliberately. A single successful hit could block a road, halt a column, and force dismounted crews into exposed positions. German commanders understood what was happening. They issued warnings, they reinforced tactics, but they could not eliminate the threat without changing the nature of armored operations themselves. The bazooka had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a weapon that sometimes worked. It was a factor every tank commander had to consider every time infantry was present. Armor superiority still mattered, but it no longer guaranteed safety. The balance had shifted quietly but decisively. And as the war moved into its final phase, that shift would be tested under the most extreme conditions possible, where armor, infantry, weather, and desperation collided at full scale.
The turning point became unmistakable in the winter of 1944, when the war in Western Europe entered its most desperate phase. Germany's final offensive in the Ardennes was designed to restore momentum through surprise, speed, and concentrated armor. Tanks were meant to punch through thin Allied lines, exploit confusion, and reach critical crossings before defenses could reorganize. But the battlefield they entered was no longer the one they remembered. Snow and forest narrowed movement corridors, visibility collapsed. Infantry clung to villages, road junctions, and ridge lines. In these conditions, tanks could not operate independently. They needed close coordination, constant protection, and time. What they encountered instead were infantry units that no longer withdrew at the sound of engines. Bazookas were everywhere. American soldiers waited inside shattered houses, behind embankments, along forest trails. Shots were taken at close range, aimed deliberately. A single penetration was often enough to immobilize a tank, turning it into a burning obstacle that blocked roads and forced columns to halt. Each disabled vehicle compounded the problem for those behind it. German crews reported engagements where tanks were lost without warning, without artillery fire, and without visible enemy guns. Armor skirts offered limited protection. Angled plates reduced some risks, but they could not eliminate vulnerability at close range. The battlefield punished hesitation as much as exposure. In the Ardennes, the bazooka did not merely destroy tanks, it disrupted plans. Delays multiplied, columns slowed, infantry escorts were stretched thin. Every pause allowed Allied artillery and air power to regain influence. What was meant to be a rapid breakthrough became a grinding advance under constant threat. By this stage of the war, German industry could not respond fast enough. Heavier armor increased weight and reduced mobility. Tactical adjustments demanded fuel and trained infantry that no longer existed in sufficient numbers. The bazooka exploited constraints that could not be fixed mid-campaign. The effect was cumulative. Each encounter reinforced a new reality. Tanks could still dominate open ground, but they could not ignore infantry. Close-range anti-armor weapons had erased the assumption of safety within occupied terrain. This was the irreversible moment. After the Ardennes, no German commander could plan armored operations without accounting for infantry-held ground as a lethal environment. The balance between protection and vulnerability had shifted permanently. Armor was still essential, but it was no longer sovereign. What followed was not collapse, but recognition. And recognition carried consequences that extended beyond the battlefield, shaping how the war would end and how future wars would be fought. When the fighting moved beyond the Ardennes and Allied forces pushed steadily toward Germany, the effects of the bazooka were no longer debated, they were accounted for. What had begun as a tactical surprise became a permanent consideration in operational planning on both sides. For Allied forces, infantry anti-tank capability altered how advances were conducted. Units no longer waited passively for armored support to neutralize enemy tanks. Instead, infantry formations were structured with organic anti-armor teams embedded at the platoon and company level. This reduced dependence on perfect coordination and allowed momentum to be maintained even when armor or artillery lagged behind. Reports from late 1944 and early 1945 show a consistent pattern. German armored vehicles were increasingly lost in close terrain, villages, road junctions, wooded approaches, before they could influence the larger battle. Even when tanks were not destroyed outright, immobilization was often enough.
A disabled track or damaged engine removed the vehicle from the fight and created obstacles that slowed entire formations. German forces responded as best they could. Schürzen, thin armor skirts, were added to many tanks to reduce the effectiveness of shaped charges. Infantry screens were reinforced. Movement became more deliberate. But these measures carried trade-offs. Added armor increased weight. Tighter infantry coordination required manpower Germany could no longer spare. Slower movement ceded initiative. What the bazooka had done was compress decision-making time. Tank commanders no longer had the luxury of reacting gradually. Exposure carried immediate risk. This forced caution at moments when speed had once been decisive. The cumulative effect showed in casualty and loss reports. While no single weapon accounted for all armored losses, infantry anti-tank weapons contributed a growing share. The bazooka did not replace anti-tank guns or air power, it complemented them. Together, they created overlapping layers of threat that armor could not avoid entirely. Psychologically, the shift was equally important. German tank crews reported heightened stress in built-up areas. Confidence in armor protection declined. The need for constant vigilance slowed tempo and reduced operational flexibility. Tanks remained powerful tools, but they no longer dominated encounters with infantry by default. For Allied infantry, the effect was stabilizing. Units under pressure could now resist armored thrusts long enough for support to arrive. Defensive lines became more resilient. Breakthroughs became harder to sustain. The bazooka did not eliminate fear, but it replaced helplessness with agency. By early 1945, these changes were embedded in daily combat. They were no longer lessons to be learned, but realities to be managed. Infantry and armor had entered a new relationship, one defined by interdependence rather than hierarchy. And as the war approached its conclusion, that relationship would shape not only how battles were fought, but how victory was secured.
As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the effects of infantry anti-tank weapons were no longer confined to battlefield reports. They began to appear in doctrine, training manuals, and post-war assessments. The bazooka's influence extended beyond the destruction it caused. It reshaped assumptions. German armored doctrine, built around shock and momentum, had relied on a clear hierarchy of threat. Heavy guns, mines, and aircraft were dangers to be planned around. Infantry, by contrast, had been a manageable risk. That hierarchy collapsed once shaped charge weapons became widespread. Armor could no longer dictate engagement terms simply by appearing. Post-war German evaluations acknowledged this shift with unusual clarity. Analysts noted that close-range anti-tank weapons had forced tanks into increasingly defensive postures. The need for constant infantry protection reduced operational speed. Armored thrusts became cautious advances. The very qualities that once defined armored warfare, initiative and exploitation, were constrained. For the Allies, the bazooka reinforced a broader trend toward distributed lethality. Firepower no longer resided exclusively in specialized units. It moved downward, closer to the individual soldier. This did not eliminate the need for tanks or artillery, but it changed how they were used. Combined arms became less about sequencing and more about simultaneity. Statistical studies conducted after the war reflected this reality. While exact attribution varied, infantry anti-tank weapons accounted for a significant portion of armored losses in close terrain during the war's final year. Immobilizations proved nearly as decisive as penetrations. A tank that could not move was a liability rather than an asset. The bazooka's limitations were also recorded honestly. Short range, reduced effectiveness against heavy frontal armor, and vulnerability of the operator were all noted. These shortcomings drove further development. Improved models followed quickly. Other nations adapted the concept, refining shaped charges and delivery systems. The weapon's influence outpaced its original design. By the time the war ended, the bazooka had become more than a specific piece of equipment. It was a proof of concept. Infantry could carry the means to defeat armor decisively. This principle would shape post-war weapons development, from recoilless rifles to guided anti-tank missiles. Importantly, the change did not render tanks obsolete. Instead, it redefined their role. Protection alone was no longer sufficient. Awareness, coordination, and support became equally critical. Armor survived not by intimidation, but by integration. In that sense, the bazooka marked a transition point. It closed a chapter in which tanks operated above infantry threats and opened one in which vulnerability was an accepted condition of power. As the war concluded, this understanding settled quietly into military thought. It did not require proclamation. The evidence was already scattered across battlefields, burned-out hulls, blocked roads, and reports written in careful language. What remained was interpretation.
When the war ended in Europe, the wreckage left behind told a story that numbers alone could not. Tanks still lay where they had fallen, on roads, in fields, beside shattered buildings. But the meaning of those machines had changed. They were no longer symbols of unquestioned dominance. They were reminders of a balance that had shifted. The bazooka did not overwhelm armored warfare through scale or spectacle. It changed it through proximity. By placing decisive power into the hands of individual soldiers, it forced armies to confront a new reality. Protection was no longer absolute, and mobility no longer guaranteed safety. Steel could be defeated not by heavier steel, but by precision applied at the right moment. This shift carried consequences far beyond the Second World War. It altered how militaries thought about power on the battlefield. Firepower moved downward. Vulnerability became a shared condition. Tanks remained essential, but they could no longer exist apart from the infantry that protected them. Warfare became less about singular platforms and more about systems working together under constant threat. The bazooka also revealed something deeper about modern conflict. Innovation did not always arrive as a dramatic leap. Sometimes it appeared as a quiet correction, an answer to a problem that had been accepted for too long. Infantry had lived in the shadow of armor because no alternative existed. Once one did, belief changed faster than doctrine. That change mattered. It reshaped how soldiers behaved, how commanders planned, and how wars would be fought in the decades that followed. From recoilless rifles to guided missiles, the lineage was clear. The idea that a single soldier could challenge a machine transformed battlefield logic permanently. In the end, the bazooka was not remarkable because it destroyed tanks. Many weapons could do that. It was remarkable because it ended the assumption that tanks alone decided the fight. It proved that power, when made portable and precise, could redraw the boundaries of dominance. The armored age did not end in seconds. But in those seconds, when steel failed under unexpected force, the future of warfare quietly revealed itself.